Welcome to this video presentation to support our discussion session entitled Can Dialectical Thinking Help Us Bridge Our Political Divides? This is going to be presented at the 2021 conference of the European Society for Adult Development. We're excited to be able to lead a discussion with scholars and practitioners in this community. Our discussion will be led by Michael Basages, Tom Bedell, and me, Michael Moscolo. In this video, Michael Basages will provide an overview of the dialectical framework that will frame the session. I will then provide an overview of dialectical engagement as a method for bridging political divides. In so doing, I'll describe dialectical engagement, and I will show how it was used to facilitate the process of helping a group of 6 people from different political backgrounds develop consensus on the issue of capital punishment. We'll begin with Michael Basages' overview of dialectical thinking.
The purpose of our session is through these videos, we're going to try to develop a shared understanding of the process that my colleague Mike Moscolo has developed and named dialectical engagement as a method of bridging political divides. In the second part, during our face-to-face time, we're going to have an in vivo experience of the process of dialectical engagement. My introductory comments here aim to show how this dialectical engagement approach is rooted in dialectical thinking or dialectical analysis, and therefore is significantly different from some other conflict resolution approaches. Let's just focus on the second bullet point on the slide you see. So from my perspective, dialectical thinking or dialectical analysis as a psychological phenomenon entails assimilating experience by looking for and recognizing instances of dialectic and engaging in inquiry with this orientation. So what's an instance of dialectic? I define dialectic as developmental movement through forms. I define dialectic as developmental transformation, that is, developmental movement through forms, which occurs via constitutive and interactive relationships. Now, the phrase movement through forms is meant to distinguish such movement from movement within forms. To illustrate this distinction, let's consider what happens when a road is built connecting one city to another city. The road has a certain form to it, and the form of that road regulates the movement of the vehicles which travel between those two cities. So the movement of the vehicles represents movement within a form. On the other hand, if we consider the movement or change that's associated with decay of the road and with the emergence of trouble spots on the road, which tend to cause traffic jams or worse, accidents, and it eventually leads to the process of building a new road with a different form that replaces or supplements the old road. And so that now we have a more complex structure of ways of getting from one city to another. That's what I mean by transformation or movement through forms. Through the notion of movement through forms or transformation, the definition of dialectic both relies on and presupposes understanding the notion of movement and understanding the notion of form and focusing on a particular relationship to it. Describing this developmental movement through forms as developmental implies that there's a certain direction to it. This direction is associated with increasing inclusiveness, differentiation, and integration, or for the Piagetians among you, a level of equilibrium. The definition relates the developmental transformational movement to constitutive and interactive relationships. A relationship can be understood as a connection between things, in which the things are taken to exist prior to the relationships. The phrase constitutive relationship, or what Tom will refer to later on as internal relations, is meant to indicate the opposite, that the relationships play a role in making the parties to the relationships what they are. The adjective interactive implies that the relationship is not static, but is characterized by motion or action of the parties onto the other. Our example of the road can also be used to illustrate the concepts of constitutive and interactive relationships. The road is constituted not only by its interaction with road builders who clearly build it, but also by its relationship with vehicles that travel on it. For if no vehicles were permitted to travel on it, it might have the same physical form, but it would no longer be a road. It would perhaps be a road that had been converted to a pedestrian mall. Or if only airplanes traveled on it, it would be a runway rather than a road. Thus, its being a road depends on its particular relationship to vehicles. Likewise, it is clearly relationships with roads that make road builders road builders. It is also, though perhaps less obviously, relationships with roads that make vehicles vehicles. Vehicles are vehicles because they have the capacity to transport one someplace. And the extent to which they have this capacity is dependent on the extent to which suitable thoroughfares exist. So without the roads, a car would not be a vehicle. The relationship between the vehicles and the road is interactive as well as constitutive, in that the vehicles change the road and the road changes the vehicles. This should be clear from the previous discussion of road decay or wear, which is vehicles changing the road, and of the developing trouble spots on the road which cause accidents to the vehicles, the road thus changing the vehicles. Once again, as mentioned earlier, this interaction between the road and vehicles leads to the transformation of the whole situation that leads ultimately to the building of a new road. This is the sense in which the transformation is via constitutive and interactive relationships. Thus, the movement whereby a new road is built as a result of the interactive and constitutive relationships among the previous road users and their vehicles, and road builders can be seen as an instance of dialectic.
Political divides through dialectical engagement. So, we start off with our problem, which is well known. We have some of the greatest political polarization and intractable conflict that we have ever had, at least in the United States, with the possible exception of the Civil War. Can we bridge our political divides? Well, let's start by thinking about how we ordinarily think about conflict and how to resolve conflict. In general, we think of it as a football game, as an adversarial process. We have a football field, and there's only so much football field to go around, and we have two sides, and each side tries to beat the other side in an adversarial contest. One side gains ground, the other side loses ground, etc., etc. Only one side can win. And in political processes, this is happening in the form of a debate. For example, one side takes in a position. America first, immigrants are taking our resources. The other side takes an opposite position. Immigrants do the jobs we don't want to do. Let's keep them around. And then there's a big conflict, and then what happens is they debate and they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and the problem doesn't get solved. Dialectical engagement can provide an alternative to this type of political conversation. It has its origins in three places. One is in conflict resolution, two is in relational developmental theory, and the third is in dialectical thinking. And I want to offer dialectical engagement as a mode of political problem solving, where there are two broad phases. The first is collaborative problem solving. This comes straight from the conflict resolution literature. And this is possible in political problem solving when it is possible to separate needs and interests from political positions and ideologies. And I'll explain what that means in a little bit. The second broad phase occurs when there's a need to address conflicting ideologies per se, and that's the dialectical problem solving phase. So let's play around. Phase one, collaborative problem solving has four basic steps. The first is calmness and connecting to the humanity of the other, to the adversary, trying to act with empathy and radical engagement, finding what's human in the other side, seeing the plea of the other. And once that happens, you can have a discussion. And the idea here is that each party takes turns in identifying their own and each other's underlying needs. Each side takes a position on a political topic, and the idea is to get beyond the position, to get rid of them. And one party is in active listening mode, and they listen very carefully to the other person's version of the events. They don't interrupt the partner. They seek to identify the needs that are beneath the person's political positions. And they summarize those needs as any good clinician might and express empathy for the other person. And then the sides switch. One side is in active listening, the other side is in self assertion. The person in self assertion mode identifies their own needs and interests, expresses their needs with I statements, and describes specific situations rather than using interpretations and characterizations. After each side identifies their respective needs, both sides together brainstorm, try to find novel ways to meet their needs of all persons involved, and then they jointly invent and select a solution for mutual gain. Four steps in the collaborative problem solving process. So, for example, if we have two sides, one side takes the position, immigrants are taking our resources, and the other side takes the position, immigrants do the job we want to do, let's keep them around. Well, what happens is you look for the needs underneath the positions. So the person who is taking the position, immigrants are taking our resources, looks to the other side, tries to identify the needs that underlie their position. I want to help people fleeing from difficult situations. And the other side, guy on the right tries to identify the needs of the woman on the left. I'm afraid that my way of life is going to be destroyed. Those are their needs. And what happens is you take the needs that have been buried and you bring them to the surface. You get rid of the initial positions. And then what you do is you brainstorm possible way to meet each party's needs. Well, solution one, solution two, solution three, solution four to meet those needs. Solution one, solution two, solution three, solution four, solution five to meet their needs. And finally, you synthesize a solution. How do you do that? Well, you draw upon the novel ideas and put together a novel solution, a synthesis that no one has ever thought of before, possibly. That's collaborative problem solving. Now, the thing is that collaborative problem solving can be effective only as long as needs can be separated from ideological commitments and positions. And in that can happen, that a lot of effectiveness can happen in political problem solving with collaborative problem solving. Problem is that in political conflict, needs and interests are often defined by ideological commitments. And if that's so, you need collaborative problem solving is not always going to be enough. This brings us to dialectical problem solving, the synthesis of opposites. So, of course, we have a thesis. One person's side leads to an antithesis. The other person's side, they're in conflict. And then what we do is we seek a synthesis through the integration of opposites that transcends the political divide. That's dialectical problem solving. So, how do you do dialectical problem solving in a political circumstance? Well, what we've got is several steps. One, you seek out and understand the ideology of the other. Unlike in collaborative problem solving, where you're trying to separate the ideology from underlying needs, you've already tried that. You've done it. You've made progress. But now you try to seek out and understand the ideology of the others. You actively seek out the contradictions between parties, and then you squint real hard. You ask each side to squint really hard and identify possible kernels of truth in the other person's ideology. Bracket the rest, and then ask each other, how can my and our ideologies change, if at all, by incorporating or accommodating to the truths we find in each other's ideologies? That's the process of dialectical problem solving in dialectical engagement. So it looks like this. You have a thesis, leads to an antithesis. The antithesis um, is confronted by the other person, and you see if you can differentiate while you preserve your core beliefs. See if your beliefs can be differentiated to accommodate to the other. Same thing the other person does. Can their beliefs be differentiated to accommodate to the truths of the other? And if so, maybe you can put those together in order to come up with a new synthesis, a new ideology, or a new fragment of an ideology. So let's show how this has been put into practice. We have a longitudinal study. It's been going on for 1 year. There are 6 participants. We taught those participants the process of dialectical engagement, collective problem solving, collaborative problem solving, and dialectical problem solving. There's a mediator. The mediator managed the engagement of political issues between the any two people, engaging in collaborative problem solving and dialectical engagement. These are the 6 participants. They differed in age, in gender, in religion, in race, and in political orientation. And so let's go through the process. Let's show how this happened over months of dialogue. This is a distillment of the process of dialectical engagement. Phase 0, we had them engage in a debate. Maureen and Cliff had a debate about the death penalty. And it goes pretty much as you might expect. Maureen is against classical capital punishment. She says it's warranted only in very extreme cases. Cliff says he's for the death penalty, at least when it's beyond a reasonable doubt. Maureen comes back with, well, it better be very rare. It's got to be beyond any doubt at all, which probably is impossible. Cliff comes back with, there are people who are evil on the earth. There are people who do not belong on the earth because of what they've done. Maureen comes back and says, well, that may be the case, but I'm worried about the fairness of the criminal justice system. We execute innocent people of color, of class. Wait a minute. You say that that minorities are executed more often than majorities. Well, whites are put to death more often than other races in the United States. Maureen comes back with, well, what's the percentage of whites in the United States versus who commits crimes? And the debate goes on and on and on with no resolution. So let's try an alternative. Let's go with the first phase, phase 1, collaborative problem solving. Instead of debating the issue, we reframe the issue. It's not about capital punishment, but it's instead, how do we respond to heinous crime? We define heinous crime. Heinous crime is an example of it would be first-degree premeditated murder, cruel, unrepentant, painful, humiliating mass murder, killing of children, that sort of thing. This is what the group of 6 came up with. Well, when someone commits a heinous crime, what are our needs? Again, separating needs from positions. Well, we have a need, a lot of people feel, for justice, for just desserts, even vengeance, some sort of consequences. We have a need to keep the public safe. We have a need for prevention of heinous crime in the first place. We have a need to understand the origins of heinous crime. We have a need for fairness in the criminal justice system. We have a need to address the pain of victims and their families. And the group, through weeks of discussion, was able to come up with a suite of solutions for these various needs. To keep the public safe, imprison the perpetrator, perhaps life imprisonment with or without parole. If rehabilitation is possible, do that. In order to prevent heinous crime, well, socialization, foster moral understanding in children, teach restorative justice to children early on, teach boys and men self-control, address conceptions of masculinity, teach people how not to be victims. Prevention, transform society, make some structural changes, have a national discussion of values, invest in early and childhood intervention, invest in health care and mental health services, create economic security for people. In order to understand the origins of crime, engage in research. In order to and to address fairness in the criminal justice system, seek out fair procedures for incarceration that address race and socioeconomic processes, reorganize police values rather than defund, but reorganize police values, train police in community skills, adopt a team partnership approach, treat prisoners as people, eliminate profit for prisons. How do we address the needs of the pains of victims' family? Perhaps through restorative justice, by making amends to victims, by showing self-transformation on the part of the perpetrator, by teaching grieving and forgiveness as a possible way to address pain in victims. And all of these were shared by all of the 6 people in the group. So by recasting the idea from capital punishment to the underlying needs and issue, we were able to come up with a suite, and this is just a small representation, a system of ways of reconciling those needs. Now, there was some we couldn't. The question of justice, just deserts, vengeance, and consequences, people didn't agree. Death, consequences, restorative justice, public shaming were things that were suggested that there was not a solution to. And so we need to move on to dialectical problem solving to see if we can deal with that. So there we go. Second part, dialectical problem solving on these issues. Let's take a look at what Maureen and Cliff's conflicting ideologies were after the collective collaborative problem solving process. Well, Maureen believed in the inherent dignity of all persons. She believes that some people have diminished responsibility and predisposing conditions that lead them to certain types of crimes. She believes people are capable of redemption, that capital punishment does not always make victims wholes, and that capital punishment makes us killers. These are ideological beliefs. Cliff, on the other hand, believes that some people are evil and therefore irredeemable. Heinous crime should be met with justice or even revenge in order to balance the moral scales. Perpetrators should get their just deserts and be held responsible. And victims need justice and protection, and death brings some degree of closure. Now, what do we do now? What we do now is we have Maureen and Cliff engage each other's ideological beliefs and ask, is there some kernel of truth that's beneath each of these that each person can endorse in the other's perspective? And if so, let's see if through dialectical problem solving we can synthesize new ideas. So we'll start with Maureen engaging Cliff's ideology. There's Cliff's ideology, and we ask, are there any kernels of truth there? Maureen, is there any kernel of truth at all to Cliff's assertion that some people are evil and irredeemable? Well, the discussion went like this, and you'll see the dialectical process. There's Maureen, there's Cliff. We start with Cliff saying, people could commit heinous crimes. Some people are evil, irredeemable. That calls out in Maureen the idea that well, that may be true, but it is very rare. Only very few people are irredeemable. But this conflicts with her own idea that of the inherent dignity of all people. If some people are irredeemable, this calls out in Cliff an idea that there are psychopaths who kill without empathy, and this conflicts with Maureen's belief in the inherent dignity of all people. She says it's really hard to find inherent dignity in psychopaths who kill without empathy, and therefore she transforms her initial position from people there's inherent dignity of all people to she qualifies it to the inherent dignity of almost all people, but she's still very uncomfortable with that statement. So we've moved from some people are evil and irredeemable, and Maureen changes her idea to the inherent dignity of almost all people. What about the next assertion? Um, People who commit heinous crimes should have justice or revenge to balance the moral scales. Here's how this conversation went. It started again with Cliff talking about the need to avenge evil. And Maureen said, no, I don't like this term revenge. I'm not sure why, but I remember reading that revenge was really functioning to make other people, the perpetrator, experience how it feels to have the crime. That's why we should have revenge, which isn't quite revenge. And Cliff, that conflicts with uh, Cliff's notion that revenge is there to avenge evil. Then the moderator said, "Well, let's separate revenge from justice. What about justice? Is there some sense of justice in capital punishment? Any legitimacy to that, Maureen?" And Maureen says, "Well, the justice is for the victim or for society." And she differentiates the idea of consequences from revenge and justice. We need consequences, but not necessarily revenge or not necessarily capital punishment for the purpose of justice. And so this is her conception. What she comes up with is that we need consequences, but not necessarily capital punishment. So, you know, in response to Cliff's statement, she was able to say, yes, on justice. We do need justice. But consequences is a better concept than revenge or just desserts. And we need to hold people responsible, but we may not need capital punishment. What about this last idea here? Victims need justice, and death brings closure. How did this conversation go? Well, Maureen recalled actually an earlier conversation that she had with Ellie, where Maureen expressed her views against capital punishment, and Ellie described the experience of a family member whose loved one was killed, and the perpetrator, the murderer, went to jail, and then years later, 20 years later, went out on parole. And she described the horrific experience of the victim's family having to relive the experience of the murder of the loved ones because they had to go in and testify at the parole hearing. This led Maureen to say, well, my goodness, I don't think that people, I've attended enough to the needs of victims, and the victims have inherent dignity as well. And she came to the conclusion that anti death penalty advocates do not adequately address the needs of victim families. And so she changed her view about the victims needing justice and protection. That death, when she addressed Cliff's idea that death brings closure, she didn't come up with the idea that death brings closure. She didn't agree with that, but she did change her view to the idea that anti-criminal capital punishment advocates should address the needs of victims' families better. So that was time to switch turns. It's time for Cliff to engage Maureen's ideological beliefs. Are there any kernels of truth there? And so we start off with Maureen's ideological beliefs, and we ask Cliff, again, are there any kernels of truth? And he looks at the first three and he says, geez, how can you not agree? He agrees with all of them. And then, yep, does capital punishment always make victims whole? No, he agrees with that too. It doesn't always make victims whole. Does capital punishment make us killers? Well, actually, he's not going to agree with that one. He doesn't believe that capital punishment makes them killers. So let's engage that. How did that conversation go? Well, Maureen starts off with capital punishment makes us killers. Cliff says, well, no, capital punishment executes the collective will of the people. We don't have a hangman, for example. That it's not one killer. It's really a collective process. At which point the moderator, the mediator, asked Cliff, wait a minute, when somebody's executing, must not someone flip a switch and kill? I mean, isn't there killing going on? And Cliff said, yeah, that's killing. When that happens, that's killing. Um, but society must have laws to deter crime. And this led the mediator to make a distinction between the possibility of killing on the one hand and legitimate killing on the other hand. Are you saying, Cliff, that what you're saying is that it is killing, but it is legitimate? And that's what he agreed with. He said that capital punishment is indeed killing, but it's legitimate killing. And this, of course, conflicts with Maureen's belief that capital punishment makes us killers. It is illegitimate. Capital punishment does not make us killers, according to Cliff, because capital punishment is legitimate killing. So, with respect to this last piece on Maureen's ideology, when he engaged it, he embraced the idea. In fact, we are killing, but he says that it is legitimate killing. So, where does this all leave us? Here's the joint solution that was created after several months of discussion. Well, we have all of the solutions to the needs that were created through collaborative problem solving that we talked about before. A really remarkable, at least in my view, set of solutions that were agreed upon, but also a set of shared beliefs. These beliefs included the inherent dignity of almost all people. Some people do commit heinous crimes. Some people have diminished capacity and disposing conditions, so that they should be treated accordingly. Perpetrators must be held responsible, subject to their capacities for control. There's a need for consequences to heinous crime. Many, but not all, or some, but not all perpetrators are capable of redemption. There's a need to address the victims and their families, and capital punishment makes some victims whole, but not others. The unshared beliefs included the following: irredeemable people are rare, and thus so should capital punishment be rare. Capital punishment makes us killers. Uh, Cliff didn't agree. Some people are evil and irredeemable, and perpetrators of heinous crime should be put to death and get their just deserts. So we've got shared beliefs, we've got non-shared beliefs, we've got a system of a great deal of agreement, and then we have a disagreement still, but over over very, very thorny issues about which each participant felt uncomfortable with their final decisions. Cliff is Catholic and felt a great deal of discomfort in advocating the death of murderers, especially given his pro-life conditions, his pro-life beliefs, and his Catholicism. And Maureen, believing in the UU principle of Unitarian Universalist principle that all lives have inherent dignity, struggled with the idea that human life of the murderers, of killers, also did not have dignity, or whether they did. Dialectical engagement can provide an alternative to traditional adversarial approaches to political discussion and can hopefully provide a framework to bridge our political divides.